Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to listen to me, and thank you so much to you all for having me as well. Hopefully, this will be a really insightful talk for you. So, today I'll be talking about UX as a tool for empathy and exactly what I mean when I refer to UX as a tool that we can use in game development, and specifically around how do we understand our teams, so our game development teams, a lot better, and how do we understand our players a lot better and build a connection between both teams and the players to make really memorable and cool experiences. Um, so I'll do a quick overview of me in case anyone doesn't know much about me. So I studied at the University of Warwick up till 2017. I was studying psychology there for 3 years. And in my second year, I was very lucky to get the opportunity to intern at Exient as a game designer, doing bits of UX. So I had no games experience before then, nor did I have any UX expertise. But I came in as like a consultant and intern, helping the studio understand a lot more about how psychology can be used in game development, and generally how do you think about players from a psychology perspective so you can make better experiences for them. So I did that whilst I was studying at uni, and then once I graduated, I consulted at Well Played Games, who are also based in Leamington. And this was for the soft launch of Warhammer Combat Cards. So again, I came as a consultant and gave a ton of feedback on the game that they then implemented going ahead. And I'm currently at NetSpeak Games. I've been there since 2019, and we're working on a wholesome MMO. So we're going for a non-violent experience that can be shared with your friends, and that's still currently in development. Outside of my job, I'm part of Pock and Plate, which is an initiative to get more people of colour in the industry. So we do a lot of regional events around the UK, helping people get jobs. We do a lot of career support workshops as well, and we do lots of talks from industry professionals as well, so people can understand the different jobs and opportunities available as well. And at the moment, as of January, I've been a mentor for third-year students at Canterbury University. So I've been helping them scope out their final year projects and helping them think about UX and UI in their projects. And it's actually really exciting to see just the creativity and the ideas that like the next generation of game developers have. So I have a lot of optimism around it. I'm really looking forward to working with a lot of them. But as you can see, like a lot of the stuff I've done is very people focused, and a lot of my interests, work related and not work related, are people focused. And I think that's why UX has been the thing for me, and why I think everyone should be doing bits of UX regardless of their role. So I kind of want to strip it back a little bit before even talking about what UX is that we tend to think of UX in like a really abstract term, and like it's this really huge, confusing thing. But I think UX has been something part of game development right from the beginning, even though there hasn't really been a definition right from the beginning. So the example I'm talking about here is that like games can look the same, a lot of them, but they don't feel the same. And UX provides a lot of definition around what that feeling is. So the example I've given here is on the left is like Fortnite Mobile's UI, and then on the right is of a game called Fortcraft. So these games look very similar on mobile, but they provide very different experiences. And they both aren't of the same level of popularity, right? So you can say that's down to the marketing. Obviously, that plays a huge role, but that also comes down to the experience design that you've given. So why is it that players retain in a game like Fortnite, and why do they find it interesting, even though both games look really similar, right? And that kind of shows you the distinction between UX and UI, where it's like UX is heavily focused on experience design, whereas UI does hit on UX, but it's not just about the visuals when it comes to UX. Like if you are interested in becoming a UX designer, for example, you don't really need to know how to be an artist or UI designer, for example. Because of that, it's more about how do you showcase your solutions and things like that. So in the case of Fortcraft, is like it looks very similar, but the implementation or the game dev experience on the team or the skills or like things like company culture all impacted in creating a different product. And UX hits all those different parts of the process, and ensuring that we operationalize and provide structure to what the player experience is. So if I'm breaking this down a little further, when I'm talking about UX, I'm talking about the psychology of the player and taking an evidence-based approach and using research to better understand your players. So I'm thinking about what behaviors and emotions are elicited by our players and how do people interact with our game? What expectations do they come with when they are about to load up a game? And what things do they expect to be laid out for them and things like that? With the core goal of UX translating the intent of the designers or the business needs, as both are important to a UX person, is business and design, and bringing them both together to create a really cool experience. The way I think about this is actually based on a quote by Raf Costa. So he talks about how game design can provide a lot of complexity to the experience, which is great in its own way because it provides a lot of deep thought and systems and mechanics to the game. But UX supports game design in the sense that it provides a lot of clarity to that complexity for the player. So they're better able to understand what the design is of the game. And then this can be broken down into 3 really important areas, I think, UX has. So the first is usability, which is more of the objective part. So this is what we traditionally see in the form of playtesting, for example, is directly putting your game in front of players and getting actual feedback that you can use to inform your design decisions. So you've got some research behind the choices that you make. This can be qualitative data in terms of like interviews, or it could be quantitative. So maybe working with your data analysts, for example, to get some metrics to show like players are falling off at certain points or they're enjoying certain areas as well. The next area is providing an engaging experience. So this is more about the subjective part of the experience. So is it what affordances do we have for players? What feedback do we have for them? What flow do they have with the feature, and what interaction points do they have? And how do they work together to create something truly memorable? And then I think there's a third part to this actually, which is inclusion. So this is in the form of accessibility. So being inclusive of different types of players with different needs, but also different life experiences and ways that they can engage with the game as well. Being open to those types of experiences will help you create a more inclusive game, and as a result, have more players playing your game, which is always great because then you retain more people over time as well. So the example of like good UX I've shown here is like a really common example. The one we usually see is Dead Space. So I got a slightly more updated version of that through the use of Overwatch. So in this screenshot, I'm showing you in Overwatch, you're playing as the character soldier who has this gun as shown on the right. As you can see on the gun, there's these really small blue bars. These are showing like how many shots or bullets he has left. And the really cool thing about this is that the color of those bars are blue, so they provide some contrast with the environment. When he shoots, they make a certain sound, so you know that a shot has been done. You get some visual feedback, so you see where the bullets are going, and then when it hits someone, you then see the state of the other character change. So they might turn red and bleed, or they might die, so then you see them lying on the ground. So you can see that UX encompasses not just in terms of what we sing in terms of the UI, but also things like sound design, level design, game design, and tons of feedback as well. So in that way, UX is a really broad area, but also very specific, interestingly enough. So I wanted to talk a little bit first about the role of UX in a team. And if you are looking to hire a UX person, or if you're interested in joining a team as a UX person, where they might actually fit in. So personally, I see UX as like a really holistic role. So one that can often be embedded in a team. Usually like you're working within a feature team, or you could be not embedded. So if this usually happens at bigger companies, again, depending on the type of UX role you have, you might sit on the outside of the feature team and support all teams in their own different ways. But generally you hit every team and support them in their own way. And this is so that you can use, I guess, science, if I'm being technical, or an evidence-based approach to anticipate a lot of issues that these different teams might face with regards to developing for different types of players. So you support the player by bringing them to the table as like a key stakeholder. And you're asking constant questions to these different teams. So it won't be a surprise if as a UX person, you are spending about 50% or more of your time in meetings, just helping people understand the vision of the game or the vision of the player. So, for example, I might work with an artist to do some concept art testing to see, is the art for like certain characters quite readable? Is it culturally sensitive? Is it understandable? Is the color contrast okay from an accessibility perspective? I might work with production, for example, when I've done research and I found really big issues that I think need to be changed with the game. Working closely with production to create tickets that can then be fed into the pipeline for the team to work on would be another one. Or even with community managers, so better understanding who our players are and what type of backgrounds they have. I'll go more into detail about that in a little bit, but as you can see, it touches so many different parts of development, and there's so many different areas UX can support as well. I also think UX works as a way of bringing the different game dev disciplines closer to the players. And I think this works very differently to how a community manager works. It's very different in that sense. It's more about ensuring like the understanding or the mental models, as we call it, of the game, of the players and the team kind of align with each other, and to minimize the gap between those mental models and understanding of each other. So for UX, it's really important to understand like the language that both use when they're talking about a feature or problem they're having, so that we can ensure we're solving the same problem together. And that sounds really great, but it's really hard to say who those players are. And I think that's often been a missing part in game dev, is better understanding who those players are. So I want to cover some ways of how you, whether as an indie or a student or a smaller studio, can better understand your players and then make more informed choices about your game. So therefore you are being more empathetic about your players. So I think the way I'm going to break this down is talk about the process that a UX person usually goes through when they're working on a feature. And I'm going to talk about like the key questions that they think about at each stage of the development process, but also what different tools that they use. Some of them you may have heard of, others you may have not, but you're more than welcome to ask me questions about them afterwards as well. So the initial stage usually is initial research. So this usually happens right at the start of the project. And your goal here is to find out, who is this player and are we making the right game for them? Is this a game that people are even going to be interested in? So this could be engaging in a lot of market research type work, seeing what other competitor games are out there, maybe breaking down the UX of those games as well. You could do interviews with different players of the demographic that you're interested in. Like, are they interested in the type of game you're making, or have they played similar games? What have they struggled with when they've played those types of games? Maybe there's a gap you can fill there. I've already mentioned concept art testing, but that's always a really good one for just assessing, like, can people understand what your game themes will be or ideas will be, just getting some initial ideas. And then, of course, a lot of games or a lot of game dev companies do early prototyping as well, just so you can get something out there to test with players as a proof of concept. Or maybe if you're pitching to investors as well, it's always good to do these 4 different types of things to show that you really understand your player, because you will then make a better game in the long run. So I always recommend doing these types of things early on. You don't really need a huge resource or budget to do these. Like, even for me, I spent a lot of time on Google just figuring out these things, or connecting the players through Twitter, through Reddit. There's always alternative modes that you can take. The next stage, I think, is scoping out things. So specifically, I mean scoping out different features or what the vision of the game will be. So in this position, you probably work very closely with your game designers, the business leads, maybe your tech leads. Also, if you're working in free to play, this will be your product managers as well, and data scientists, just to ensure you are making something that will work as a live game as well, which is super important these days. And the goal here is to figure out, what is the problem space? What is the experience we're trying to provide? What is the key problem or set of problems that our players are facing with competitor products that we can solve? And at this point, you're kind of encouraging the team to think more about the players. And it's a really good point to get them to start thinking about them in this way, because a lot of UX work is actually quite preventative. Like, we want to minimize the amount of risk that we take in the long run by understanding our players really well right now. So at this moment, like a UX person like myself will engage in a lot of UX advocacy. So we'll talk a lot about what UX is at our companies, or we'll do a lot of workshops breaking down feature specs, and bring in a lot of questions that we think the player will ask based on the initial research that we did. We might create some UX documentation. So this is things like standardizing our UX rules. What are just like how you have game design pillars, you can have UX pillars, for example, or if you're designing some UI, create some rules around that. Like we can't use these colors, but we can use these ones, or we can only use error messages at certain points, but not others. Some bits of UI can only be placed on certain parts of the screen, and this must be consistent. So just providing some structure to the team's work, especially during the scoping phase, or whatever other name you want to give it, where we're exploring different ideas, is good to give people some grounding as well, so we have a good reference point. I'll talk more about the how might we and sketches and things later, but the general idea of scoping is to ensure that the team's vision is aligned. And then the next one is around designing, and I put this in quotes because this is what people usually see as traditional design. But I would say the whole process from research to testing is actually design in itself. So this comes down to how you actually define it. But at this point, it's a very, very collaborative process. So the focus here is how do we get our feature design right the first time? How do we get our flows, our feedback right the first time, so we have less fixing and less concerns to deal with much later on? So the tools you could be using here are things like wireframes, like very, very low fidelity wireframes. I'll show some examples later. Again, just to get your idea across. You can then have certain discussions with the team, breaking down that wireframe and justifying the decisions that you've made. You can use decision trees or information architecture. So saying things like, if player taps this button, this happens. And then maybe blowing this up on a huge board, interactive whiteboard, and have everyone read it and see if there's any errors in logic, or if there's other use cases you haven't thought about that you may have forgotten. And at this point, it's really good to think about different player types as well. So you could maybe have different decision trees for different players, or just have different use cases for them as well. I just realized I have a typo. I'm so sorry. But you can have some prototypes as well. Really easy click-through prototypes to show your ideas. Or you can use the production method of Moscow, which is what I do a lot more now, especially when with UX, there's also really good levels of UX you can have on a feature. But it's really important, given how fast-paced development is outlining, okay, what's the MVP version of this? What is the most essential things for our players that they have to see in version 1 of this feature versus things we can add later on? And that's a skill that I'm still learning, and it takes a lot of time to learn, especially as a UX person when you're fighting for the player and you're like, I think the player really needs this, but we might not have enough resource. So that's a really good one. And then the next one is around design and tech reviews. So working very closely with your tech team and your design team actually to see if your idea can actually be, and maybe have them think more about the user as well. So why we might go with a much more detailed solution than they originally thought, justifying that the player might need X, Y, Z layers of feedback in order to understand the feature. And the focus here is around learning communication skills in the designing phase as well. Like, how do you communicate with different players to fight for the user? Communicate with different team members to fight for the user is a really good one. So then the next one is actually testing. So this is what we traditionally called play tests, or any form of testing with players. So once you have your feature implemented, whether that's like in the build or as a prototype, it's always really good to get it out to the players as soon as possible, even if it isn't super polished. Players are very forgiving. And it's also a really good way to assess usability. So do people actually understand what's going on? And for you as a team to understand, like, is the amount of feedback and information and direction we've given enough, or do we need to add more? So again, you could do playtests, you could do long form diary study. So this is where you have players record their experience over like a 10, 30, 60-day period even, and then see common patterns across players. You might want to test your first time user experience, or you might work closely with the data analytics team when the game goes live and is in live ops to see where are people dropping off. So looking at really important key performance indicators or KPIs, like retention and engagement and even conversion maybe, then would be really good. So working closely with the marketing team around that would be really good. And the key questions here that you want to think about are, where can we improve? So where can we tweak the design a little bit and make it more interesting? And how do we retain our users as well? Because thinking about the business side is always super, super important. But the fun part of testing is that you can get a lot of evidence to show that, hey, we need to make maybe a more polished experience, or we need to add more features. And that's always a really interesting part of it. But going through this process is really important as a way of building trust and building layers of understanding of the player at different stages of development. And here I'm actually showing like a very linear process. You'll often find, because game development is so messy, you'll probably be jumping between a bunch of these, and that's fine, as long as you are trying these and experimenting with different tools to see what works best for you and your company. So I want to talk a little bit about how you can get started if you're really interested in finding out how to connect with your players. And the first thing is actually just learning who your players are as people. So here I've shown a quote by a design lead at Bumble, who at the time was at Bumble, which is a dating app. And she was talking about how usability is super important when it comes to user experience, because then you understand what people know about how to use the product. But also the other side of this is the experience that you create. So in the context of dating, for example, app users are very vulnerable with their emotions. And that means they can be in a lot of situations where their safety might not be thought about, or they might be struggling with it. So as an app, it's really important for you to take care of your users and understand like the messiness of human emotion. And I think a lot of this applies to game design. Is like our players are very vulnerable when they're engaging with games. Like it's not uncommon for people to say, hey, I play games because I want to escape from the world, right? So people are kind of opening themselves up to you when they're playing a game. Well, not you directly, but to the product that you've made. And they're letting this game impact them on an emotional and a personal and a logical level. So when it comes to that, it's really important for us to respect the players and give them the compassion that they need, so we can empower them to have the best experiences possible by bringing down their barriers that they could face, right? And that could be in terms of accessibility, but also just on a general human level. You know, how do we take care of our players when they're engaging with our game? So an example of this is when I first joined NetSpeak, my first project was around creating player personas, which have evolved over time. But I took on this project because I thought it was really important for the team at the beginning of the development cycle to learn about who our players are. So I actually interviewed a bunch of potential players from our demographic, learn about who they were as people. So I asked them a ton of questions around, you know, what types of games do you love? What games don't you like? But also, what do you do in your day-to-day life? What matters to you on a personal level or a moral level, on an ethical level? What types of experiences are you looking for? What types of hobbies do you engage in? It's really important to have this well-rounded understanding of your users or your players, so that you can create something that they will actually connect with and actually want to come back to, because players really care about the feelings that they leave with. And that's probably what they're going to remember over time. That's one type of method you could do about learning about who your players are, but also just the general language you use in your development teams. So something I always recommend is when you're talking about your players, always be respectful, but also think about the terminology you use. So I personally like the term players, which feels like common sense to a lot of people, but others might prefer the term customer, which I generally encourage people to avoid, because again, we are not viewing our players as paying customers or people by default. We're seeing them as people first, as human first. And that's really, really important in the design process so that your team can connect with and relate to our players a lot better. And then I want to quickly talk about the different ways you can use all these insights that you've gained about your player in your actual development process. So here I'm talking about first, initially recognize who your players are, as I said in the previous slide. Then understand what their goals are. And then the third is identifying solutions that ease their experience. So this requires a huge understanding of like people's perceptions, biases, and just the general research out there about people, so that you can make an informed decision about the experience you want to create on them, for them. And all these different tools that I'm showing here are ones that pretty much anyone in the development team can use. You don't have to be a UX specific person, but they're very good ones at helping you unpack the problem space, as well as understanding why you're creating the feature that you are and why the solution that you've created is probably the best one. So for example, the first one is Affinity Mapping. So this is really good when you have a ton of information about players and you kind of want to unpack different themes and ideas and possible patterns from that so you can better understand the trends that come from it. So the photo I'm showing here is actually from the personas project that I did at NetSpeak very early on. So alongside the personas I created, I also created a really big report around like our players and who they are. So after each interview with the 20 to 30 people I talked to, I wrote down key insights on a post-it note. I put them on the board, and then I stepped back and looked at them and then grouped ones together that had common patterns or common comments. And then from there, I saw some trends arise. So for example, I've grouped them into sections of like factors impacting choices to buy a game, or what are their game spending habits, what are the gaming platforms that they have. And then from that, we have like key quotes and also some really good qualitative data around people's engagement with games. And I really like using this method when I'm working with a team. So in this case, I actually got 2 other people in my development team to work with me on grouping the post-it notes, just because there were so many. But it was also a good way to get people to interact with the data, like in their hands in a physical way. Obviously, now that we're remote, you could just do this through an interactive whiteboard, but it gets people having the discussions, which is a huge part of UX, just even beyond the game, is getting people to talk about our players and understanding who they are a lot better. The second method I'm mentioning here is how might we. So this is a really good method to use if you want to understand what problems are players actually having, or what pain points are you actually seeing in the experiences, and you want to figure out solutions to it. So in this example, we could talk about the first problem that someone has is that they can't find a location on the map. The second problem might be that actually the level design is very confusing, so people can't even find the location that they were trying to look for on the map. And then you list out all the possible solutions to fix both problems. And then you look at which solutions might be the best given your tech like resources, your budget, time, etc., but also what will be really good for the player. And then looking across the different problems and seeing if there's a similar solution. So for example, with the not being able to find a location, it could just be, hey, we need to add signposts, excuse me, both on our map and in the levels. And therefore people know if I see my character standing next to a signpost in this spot, I know that they are there in the real world as well. So that problem killed 2 birds with 1 stone, right? And it's really good, again, just to get all the information written down and all the problems that you have, so that you can frame your solutions in a really adequate way. So hopefully this is one you get to use, because I love using this one. And then the third one is the one that we tend to associate with UX the strongest. So here's like a really low fidelity version of just a shop, like a mobile game shop. but it has all the really key elements of screen, like the descriptions, the different cards, the different offers. And I tend to use low fidelity wireframes and images like this when I want to communicate a solution based on the research I've done from my affinity mapping or the how might we method. So people can clearly see what my ideas are. And as you can see here, like there's no actual art skill here, and that's not important at all. It's more like, can this design or this solution adequately explain and communicate what I'm trying to say? And then you can work much more closely with your UI team to flesh this out into something really interesting. So when you're visualizing solutions, it's really good to think about the flow, obviously, but also things like feedback states or error states, and also adding descriptions to different screens as well will help people engage and understand them as well. The third thing you could do is actually just connect with your players as a development team. So this is a really good way of everyone understanding like how to engage with player data, but also seeing players engage with the game, which we don't see often. So something I do with my team is before we run a playtest, I sit down with the leads of the feature or the game, depending on what we're testing, and ask them a ton of questions around, okay, what's changed since the last playtest, or what's changed in a recent build that you want tested? What things don't you want tested? Of the things that you are testing, is there certain things that are more higher priority to be tested? Like, are there like certain broken features or features you're more concerned about? What do you count as like success criteria? So specifically around what do you count as like a good playtest result? So is it that a percentage of players complete a certain thing, or is it a percentage of players interact with the thing? And in this case, we actually get some metrics out of it as well. There's actually a lot of templates online for preparing for user tests as well that you can use. And as a team, I really recommend using them because you can list out all your objectives about, what are my research objectives? So you as a team are clear about what you're testing. What are the questions you want to ask players? Often you can ask them questions after they've done the playtest to get some more context. And in this way, you get some metrics again, if you're looking at like percentages, but also some qualitative stuff from your players. And I really enjoy this because it's like when I'm analyzing a lot of like our playtest feedback, I might drop some of it in Slack and get the team talking about like a snippet that I found really interesting. So it's like I'm already encouraging and starting discussions before I give out my executive summary report. And it could also be that the development team might start working on a problem as soon as possible, especially if it's something of high priority. But again, it gets everyone really hands-on with the process. Another way to connect team with players is through like in-game surveys you could do, or even in the sense of The Last of Us and even Candy Crush do this actually, is they provide you with accessibility menus. I think The Last of Us provides it near the start of the game, if I'm right. And getting those types of data again to showcase the point that, hey, accessibility is important, UX is important, is really going to help you in the long run. And the last thing I quickly want to talk about before I finish is talking about alternative models of game design or player motivation or just understanding people in general. So a lot of previous research on players has been centered around what we call in psychology anyway, weird participants. So these are people who are usually based in the West. They live in industrialized areas. They have good education. They tend to be rich or live in the top half of the rich people around the world, and tend to live in democratic societies or have democratic leaning politics. So again, that's a very limited sample size compared to what's available in the rest of the world in terms of ideas, beliefs, experiences, life experiences in general. So therefore, that means that there must be other ways of thinking and other ways that people want to engage with games, and the way they respond to games can differ. So the top three I quickly want to cover are well, the first one I'll talk about actually is Tandem Befriend, which is one that I think many of the people in this call actually are aware of. But it's an alternative model that says that for a lot of people, actually, when they are stressed, their physiological response is actually to release oxytocin. So this hormone actually encourages a lot of like social bonding and feelings of love, which results in the question of, okay, so what game mechanics can we create that support those feelings and reinforce those feelings and respect those feelings, right? So which ones allow people to care for things or nurture for things? An example of this is like, you can see how popular the Twitter is, like, can you pet the dog, right? Like, that's not an important part or like a part of the main quest in a lot of games, but people still want to do it, right? Especially in like really stressful games, like pets are a good respite and provide a low stress experience. To even really keep mechanics like that awesome, pets are great. And it also raises the question of, sure, people want to care, but also how does this work in first person shooter games, right? Or very competitive games? Could you potentially have Tandem Befriend experiences? I mean, that's just an open question I'm throwing out, but it's like, if you are engaging in teamwork and cooperativeness in a competitive environment, does that count as Tandem Befriend? So there's lots of open questions around that. Another model you could look at is the gamer motivation model. So this is actually based on a lot of scientific literature by Nick Yee and his team. And they, up to now, I think, again, don't quote me on this number, have interviewed over or surveyed over 140,000 people, looking at their gaming tastes and interests and motivations. And they found 6 core motivations to play games. So they are action, social, mastery, creativity, achievement, and immersion. So, and even then, those break down into more complex and more detailed ones as well. So you can see there's actually a fairly broad spectrum. And the interesting thing about this model is it just looks at people's general experiences across games. So people can play games that are like huge shooters, right? But also really enjoy calm games like Animal Crossing and Cozy Grove and things like that. And it's kind of unpacking why people would be interested in both, even though those provide completely different experiences. So I definitely recommend reading up on that model. It's one I've generally used in my work as well when I'm trying to think about why players will play a certain type of game that I'm interested in. And then the final one I quickly want to talk about is self-determination theory. So this breaks motivations down into 3 areas. So the first one is autonomy, which is people really care about having a choice and the ability to make a decision that impacts the world. They want to have that agency and power to do that. The second one is competence. So they want a sense of progression. And an example I like of this is like in Skyrim, they have really nice skill trees. They look visually great, but also they make it a really fun and engaging experience to track your progression. And you can also decide what type of character you want to be. Like, do you want to be a mage? Do you want to go more stealth? Just having that progression kind of provides you a reason to continue playing because you want to see where you can go and what heights you can reach. And the third one, which I think feeds into a lot of what the other 2 models are saying, which is around relatedness, right? So we want to connect with other people. We want to form bonds with other people. And this breaks it down into, well, how is it when you connect with NPCs versus actual people in a game? Do you get the same types of feelings, the same type of experience? Or is it that one is more preferable than the other, but just having something to connect to and so, some social element to a game is always really, really important. So I just want to quickly close off this long talk. Thank you everyone for listening so far. Just talking about how the goal of being more empathetic with your team is to help them understand the players better, but also being empathetic of your players ensures that you create more memorable experiences for them. So UX as a discipline, as a tool, or whatever you want to call it, a really important part of your company, to be honest, provides players with the tools to create their own experiences. And I think that's what it comes down to, is how do we allow players to create the experiences that they want by understanding them a lot better. And then in the end, the goal is that players don't even notice a lot of things are like this. They're just having a very seamless experience and an enjoyable experience. And like I said earlier, it's your goal is to have your players leaving with a certain feeling, right? So they remember your game, regardless of what they did in the game, because they might come back for multiple sessions, especially if it's a live game, right? They're going to play it and grind it a lot. So what is that consistent feeling or motivation do they come back to? And the last point I want to make is just remember that like UX provides a lot of context to game development, and is considerate of both the teams and the players. So I recommend like just trying out some of the tools I mentioned today, or even just looking into some of the theories. And I'm sure you'll be more mindful about the experiences you want to create for players. So yeah, thank you.
I have to do imaginary collapse here. That was awesome. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Oh my God. It's a really interesting one. I haven't really thought about it too much in detail. So I think it very much comes down to what type of experience you want to create, as I've said earlier, but also how important is it for players to know that type of information at a given time. So in the context of like Overwatch, for example, it's immediate and it has to be quick responding. So the fact that it's diegetic makes sense because players will be looking in that direction often. So thinking about those types of questions will really help decide if you want to use diegetic UI or another type of UI in your design. Would be a good one. Even like non-diegetic or like spatial, for example.
Gotcha. That makes sense. I also, sorry if I'm being greedy with you with questions. I also wanted to ask about what your experience is like working with sound designers when it comes to your UI implementation. Do you find this particular tool or technique that works really well for your UI design? Just any experiences you've had with it, really. I'd love to basically devour your brain here.
So to be honest, I work too closely with sound designers, but when I have, and we use them a lot at NetSpeak, we always get them involved like within our design discussions and our UI meetings as well. So like from a UX perspective, it'll be very similar to how I'm assessing a piece of art, right? It's like, is it clear what this bit of sound is trying to communicate? Is it the right type of sound, like the pitch and things like that? Does it suit the theme of our game? I think that's a really big part of UX as well, is ensuring consistency. So does this fit in with like the feel and the world of the game as well? But there's always a strong testing element to it as well, right? So it's ensuring like providing different versions of a sound for a certain type of feature or bit of feedback you want to give. And you could potentially test these with players as well, or with your team and see what suits best. And I also think about stuff like, is this culturally sensitive or will it be understood across cultures, for example? So it's providing like a huge sanity check is what I say UX does. And I think that applies to sound design as well.
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much for that.
Thank you as well. Thank you.
Cheers. Many thanks.
Absolutely fantastic questions there. We've had another one come in. Someone is looking to potentially move careers into the UX field, but not necessarily only in games. How best would someone a little later in their career move over? They've been on a few boot camps, but most entry-level jobs they see are requiring several layers of experience.
I mean, so for that person, you're doing a great job already by being part of this Discord. You're meeting some incredible people who can help you better understand how the industry like runs, how does the game development process work. Networking is a huge part of it, right? Meeting people who have the same interests as you or who can mentor you and support you in your journey would be super useful. And it's great to see how active this Discord is actually as well. So you can always be asking regular questions. Mentorship is another one, as I mentioned. So Limit Break mentorship is currently open for applications. So if you currently fill any of the eligibility criteria, I highly recommend applying for that, because then you can find a mentor who will guide you through this. If you've done boot camps, then you've probably started working on your portfolio. So one way you can add projects to your portfolio, and it's something I did as well, even though I didn't play many games at the time, before I got my job at like NetSpeak, was actually just breaking down the UX or design of a lot of games. So writing blog pieces on this. Some people might do a video essays. This shows that you can, and generally about the process behind design and what types of questions you can think about. So networking, portfolio, and game jams. Actually, game jams are a huge one. They regularly run, and they're a good way of building your skill in a short period of time. And again, you can use that on your portfolio as well. So I think there's definitely lots of different tools, and there's lots of people willing to support you out there. So it's just reaching out. And similarly to that, a lot of the industry is on Twitter. You don't have to be super active on there, but you could potentially be showcasing the work that you do on there. And that's how I actually found my job at NetSpeak. I was found on Twitter. And I've been posting a lot of my work on there, so that's one route you can take as well. But it's really exciting that you want to move into games. It's a great industry to be in.
I just want to comment on the limit break stuff. I was a part of that last year, and it's super useful on a personal level just for your own growth, but you get to join a lovely Slack and just meet other people that are the same as yourself, and obviously just across a lot of disciplines, and everyone's super lovely, which is fab. So yeah, I know Andrew's been doing mentoring on that as well last year. So let's see. Have another question. Are there any recommended beginner UX research courses you might recommend? I'm a HCI PhD student, so technically I should know some of the concepts, but not sure specifically what might be good to be familiarized with for this industry.
Awesome. So courses wise, I'm not 100% sure because I personally haven't taken many courses, but the Interaction Design Foundation does offer a bunch of courses and resources. Nielsen Norman, again, I'll list all of these in the chat later when I remember. Yeah, for you to check out. They have a ton of resources. I would recommend a bunch of books for UX research. So the first one is called Games User Research. It's a big blue book, and it shows you all the basics of what games user research is. I highly recommend it actually to anyone who's just interested in user research as well as to understand like the process. And it goes through a ton of case studies of how user research has been used. Another one for people wanting to get into games user research is called How to Be a Games User Researcher by Steve Bromley. So this book actually only came out about a month ago, I want to say. And it's written by Steve Bromley, who used to be a user researcher at PlayStation and a bunch of other studios. And he talks about how you can prepare yourself for the industry and build relationships. And then the other resource I would say is the Games User Research Discord. And that's full of games user researchers from all over the world, but also people in a very similar position to you, looking to get into the industry. And that's a really good way of getting resources. And they have a mentorship program actually, so that would be super helpful. Hopefully that answers the question.
Typing. Yes, they say thank you. Awesome. I love the fact that you were like, yeah, it's this blue book, and I'm like, yes, someone that is on the same wavelength as me. What book's that? That colour book. Have you got time for one? Hopefully short.
Yeah.
We think question. Cool. Someone's wondering where you look for inspiration if you are designing something.
Oh, that's a very interesting one. So I obviously look at games that are like have a similar feature to what I'm interested in developing. Those that are like of a similar genre, but also those that are of a very dissimilar genre, and see how both solve the problem or create that feature. Because it's really good to get solutions that aren't just very specific to your game, but you consider different use cases. I spent a lot of time playing those games myself. I'll probably do like a frame by frame breakdown if I have enough time, breaking down like the UI on the screen, the feedback, and things like that. I often write about like the UX pros and cons of each game's take on it. I also spend a lot of time watching Let's Plays, so seeing on YouTube and Twitch, seeing how other people interact with that feature, like people of the target audience, how are they engaging with it, and seeing if they're having any pain points that I can maybe solve, depending on if I think our users are going to struggle with this as well, from a usability perspective or an experience perspective. And the other places I look is just outside of games. Like that's something I highly recommend to everyone is play games. Sure, they're really like it's really super useful to do that, but you do need inspiration from other areas. So I tend to look into how a lot of apps are designing just in general. So like what are the ethos? What are the design patterns? Are there currently any trending design patterns? Especially because I'm working in the mobile space. So is there like any different new UI design things that I need to look at, or new interaction models? Have there been any updates to Apple bringing out new products and things like that? I'm also someone who likes reading a lot. So books are a good inspiration, but yeah, honestly, you can get inspiration from anywhere. And I think Salman just dropped a link to interface in game, which is a good repository. There's another one that just came out. I think it's the Game UI database. I'm really bad in names, sorry. By Ed Coates, who's a senior UI artist at Double 11. Yeah, the one that I just posted. And he has an insanely huge database, which he manages himself actually. So I highly, highly recommend checking that one out. That's been really helpful for me.
Thank you a lot for your answer.
No worries.
I appreciate it.
Few more moments just in case someone's got any more questions. Yeah, I think on behalf of everyone, thank you very much for your time tonight and sharing your insights as well. It's been super useful, especially, I don't know, me speaking as a programmer, definitely useful for me because I can I get too stuck in how should this work and maybe not focusing on the player side of it. So
No, thank you as well. I'm really thankful that you lot asked me to even speak today. So I'm super grateful about that. And it's a really interesting thing that you mentioned about being a programmer, because something I struggle with and I'm still learning as a UX person is like, how do you build a good relationship with your programmer? Because as a designer, I'm like, let's add all these things. And then the programmer might be like, actually, this is not technically possible. So
Here's
it's
how you do it. Buy him a coffee.
Or for a drink.
So
yeah,
yeah,
I was going to say coffee is usually my kind of go-to. I'd be like, oh, you've brought coffee. Well, go on. But yeah, it's a very good point, and I guess it kind of feeds back to that. Sort of, I feel like some of the themes that you were talking about is just kind of getting the whole team together to communicate on the game, right? You know, if you've got both the programmer and the designer in the same room to then go, hey, we could do this thing, then the coder could be like, well, actually, you know, you can't do this, but I could offer, you know, another few options. So, yeah, it's definitely been interesting. I've like been working with like my sort of UI UX designer and at my team, and you know, we're just kind of sitting in front of the PC, just going, right, well, how does this game do it? How does that game do it? And you know, been very interesting.
As a UI engineer, I think I should just add, sometimes you'd be surprised the hardest things are like what look like the simplest, smallest thing to do in a UI. It'll be like, oh, you want this really complex change to happen on these conditions? It's like, yeah, okay, we can do that. It's like, oh, you want the text to conform into a shape.
Yeah, and I think a lot of these things you just learn with time in terms of what are people's priorities, capabilities, limitations, regardless of role as well, right? And learning to work with them, because it is so collaborative. So I agree.
For sure, for sure. Jake, do you want to ask your question that you just posted up there?
Yeah, sure. Do you have any advice on how to steer UI development to prevent saturation of the UI? to kind of describe the problem a bit more, there are
Mhm.
some games which are very heavy in their UI, and it can be very overwhelming. You can have like multiple features all supported in one like UI screen at once. Sometimes there's a huge cluster of information. Like if you've played MMOs or mobile games where they're trying to show you all these different stats at once and they're all confusing and all changing at once. Do you have any advice in your experience on how you kind of prevent information saturation like that? Like for MMO games, to me, it sounds like you'd kind of just have a lot of different screens, but that is also a problem to players because it's just more obstacles.
Yeah, I think it's a very hard one that a lot of people are still trying to figure out. So obviously, what I'm saying is not absolute or the truth.
Of course.
But I think something I realized is like with UI is figuring out why do I need UI in the first place, right? So a big part of the UX job is just figuring out that figuring out if UI is the only way to display this bit of information, or could we use something else, like someone was saying earlier with sound, or can we adjust the level design to give a certain type of feedback, or could we add some narrative content to give this type of feedback? So it's always good to consider like other modes of feedback beyond just UI, which can often help with this, and yeah, portray the information that you want to. But if you are going to put in some UI, then it's a matter of thinking about how do we present it and can we actually break it down. So like, does the player have to see it in this immediate moment? Can the player find this later? Can there be certain indicators of ways that they can find it later? So like a common example is like in the HUD, so in the top, there's often a bunch of buttons. Maybe one of them can have a notification dot telling you, hey, there's something that's changed here. And then you can go look at it in your own time without that bit of UI feedback being in your face telling you, no, you got to look right now, or this huge thing has changed, right? So always think about if I'm putting a UI on the screen at a certain moment, why now, or can I do it later? And also, where can I put it on the screen to minimize desaturation as well? You can also think about like font size, colors, because they play a big role in perception as well, and impacting that saturation, I think.
Cool. Thank you. That was a great answer. Cheers.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm just imagining, am I going to try and clap? I think that's going to sound awful.
I'm just wondering if I
Give
can
it a
actually hear myself clapping.
Thank you very much for this talk, though.
Thank you.
We
Great,
need a
thank
button,
you.
like the audience cheering button.
It's just a soundboard you all have.
Yeah.
Just cheer.